Lately, I've been exploring new ways to use gouache. I've always been partial to thick paint and mixing my colors on the paper or canvas rather than my palette, but the more I use gouache, the more fascinating it becomes, and I really want to discover every method and technique of using this amazing medium. I really don't want to get too comfortable in my technique because I feel like the best way I learn is by being outside of my comfort zone. So if you've watched my previous gouache videos, you know my approach to gouache was always more of a cross between watercolor and acrylic, meaning I used it thinned down with water and really thick and juicy. I came up with a pretty reliable routine of laying down my initial layers as though it were watercolor, nice and thin, easy to control, and then I would slowly build up the thickness using less and less water until my final layer was just pure paint. Sometimes I even used a palette knife and went extra thick. I had been using gouache like this for years without any problems, like no dustiness on the final layer or cracked surfaces as some people might warn. Maybe it helps that I had always used just high quality artist grade gouache because it seems to be more resilient. And I've seen a lot of controversy about thinning gouache with water, and fair enough. I mean, everyone has their own opinion and can express themselves however they please. But I personally don't believe in following any kind of art rule until I've had a chance to try it and test out the limitations myself. And I'm always experimenting in order to find the best way I can express myself within a medium. However, I also don't want to get too stuck in my ways, as I mentioned, and if I'm ever feeling just too comfortable with my process, I immediately want to try something new. I always want to feel slightly uncomfortable because for me, that's how I know I'm learning and progressing. It's kind of a torturous way of being, but it's also the most rewarding for me because I've just noticed that my favorite pieces I've ever created were always times when I pushed myself the furthest, and usually it was trying a new technique or some kind of new workflow. So with gouache, I realized that I was getting very stagnant over the last year or so, even though I was progressing and learning. And, you know, it is really nice to sit down and just paint something knowing that it'll turn out nice. It's relaxing, but I can only do that so many times before I'm bored. So I found myself kind of leaning away from gouache for a while just because of that. And it made me realize that I just have not explored other ways of using gouache enough. And I do watch a lot of artists use gouache on YouTube and other places. And so I decided to make a list of ways that they use gouache that is different to my way of using it. I really wanted to try those things out myself. I have learned a lot over the past few weeks in doing this. And so I thought it would be fun to share two of the main changes that I've incorporated into my process, which has really pushed me to learn so much about this medium. The first thing is about mixing. Habits are really difficult to break, but I have made a conscious effort to spend more time, a lot more time, mixing my colors on the palette before placing them on the paper. And this doesn't mean I never blend my colors on the paper. I still do that too. But what I've been focusing on is mixing the correct colors and values, then placing them in the general area I need before blending. And not surprisingly, this has made me much more sensitive to color and value. And spending just a few more seconds observing a color in front of me or in the reference and accurately mixing that color has helped me so much when I go outside to paint. Rather than just frantically grabbing at different piles of paint and throwing it on the paper to see what happens, which, yeah, that is something I I do. I feel as though I've started training my mind to see colors more clearly and accurately, and it actually ends up saving me time in the end, and I get more pleasing results. The other big habit that I've been working on is perhaps the most difficult for me, is to use gouache more thickly from the beginning of the painting. So that means using almost no water in my mixes. It basically just get my brush damp enough in order to have the paint flow smoothly. Now, this goes hand in hand with accurate color mixing and placement because, as you know, gouache never fully dries or cures into a permanent layer. So any layer you put down is going to blend into a previous layer or the adjacent colors. So in order to avoid muddy colors, that color accuracy in the mixing process is even more important when working thickly. But in order to do this, in order to work more thickly, I've had to change my entire setup. I used to have a tray with a palette sponge and then palette paper on top, and I'd squeeze out little piles of paint, and that would be it. Those piles would be my source of paint for that whole session. Those piles, even though they were on the palette paper with the sponge and they were kind of staying a little bit moist, they would still dry out too fast, faster than I had wanted. And so adding water was imperative in order to get the paint to flow. So in order to be able to work more thick and juicy and get nice smooth paint throughout my session, I needed a way to have all of my colors in front of me without drying out. And I hate wasting paint, even a tiny little drop. So it took me quite a while to find a solution for this. Last year, I was gifted this lovely little container palette, which I used to use exclusively for plein air painting. But now I kind of see that, or I think that I used to use it all wrong. Or should I say inefficiently. Previously, I would squeeze little dollops of paint into each of the wells, take it out to paint, close it up, throw it in my bag, and sometimes I'd forget about it for weeks at a time, maybe longer. So that, the next time I opened it up, the paint was either stiff or it was moldy. So I did some research on how other people use these containers more successfully, and I found that a lot of artists fill up the wells with paint almost completely to the top, rather than squeezing just a little dollop in there, which is like just enough for one session. And the container then becomes a replacement for the tubes of paint. It's like the source, the mothership of the gouache. And then this container becomes your constant companion, not just something that is used every once in a while and then tucked away for weeks. And I have to admit, I was really nervous to do that because, the tubes of gouache are pretty expensive. So I was worried, like, what if I do this and it doesn't work and I just wasted half of my tube of gouache? But it works, and let me explain how. The top has a rubber seal built in, so it reduces the air circulation. And this is a good thing, but also could be a difficult thing, because on one hand, it keeps the paint from drying out between sessions, which of course is what we want. And it's really good at that. I've been using this one for weeks now this way, and nothing has come close to drying out. On the other hand, it can encourage mold to grow in the container if it's unused for too long, but I'm talking like weeks. So in order to mitigate that, the container needs to be opened maybe once a week or so, and you can take a little toothpick or something really skinny and mix up each of the wells, each of the colors, and then give it a light dusting of fresh water, ideally still distilled water, but I don't have that. And then you can cover it back up. And this has been a game changer for me. If you're ever worried about your paint getting moldy, like perhaps you know you won't be able to use it for a while or open it and do what I just mentioned, you can put a teeny drop of clove bud oil into the wells or into the paint and mix it in, because apparently that is antibacterial and it makes it pretty much impossible for the mold to grow, or, you know, it's very unlikely. And I've done this in the past with other mediums like watercolor, and some of my colors, like the rose or the reds, they tend to smell a little funky if I leave them alone for too long. So those are the ones that I put little drops of the clove bud oil in, and I have had no issues at all. An added bonus is that I find myself painting with my beloved gouache way more often now, because rather than having to get out all my tubes of paint, prepare my sponge and palette paper setup, and squeeze out just enough for each session, which of course I was always guessing about that, and I either didn't have enough or I had way too much, I've just been able to open up the palette and get going, start painting. And all of this might sound really silly, and maybe it sounds like such a little difference, but this little difference means I've been way more likely to start painting with my gouache. And it also means that I'm not wasting anything at the end of each session. Okay, so let's get back to working with thick gouache. Hopefully by now you can see how much of a difference using this container makes in being able to work thickly. Just having that convenient source of wet paint without worrying about it drying out, you know, that's what makes it possible. And while the container is open during the session, I just give it a little light misting every so often in order to just ensure that the top of the gouache doesn't dry out. And I basically just want to see that the paint is glistening at all times. If it starts to look a little bit more matte, I just give it a little spritz of moisture. And, you know, because it's such a fine mist of water, it's not diluting the paint, it's simply protecting that top layer. So I can make sure that it never dries out. One little tip I have for you if you plan on using gouache more thickly, or if you already do but maybe you're experiencing some difficulties, is that you have to keep your brush clean and just slightly damp at all times. The reason for this is because you've probably noticed how fast gouache dries, and the longer it's on your brush, the more it's going to get in between all those little bristles, and as it starts to dry out, it really just clogs up the brush. And in my experience, this leads to uneven brush strokes and very, very like dry brush effects, which of course are great for their own reasons, and you can use them in your painting to get different textures. But it's not ideal for when you want to get big layers of even color, or, you know, just fill in a larger area of paint and you want it to go on nice and smoothly. So how I control this is whenever I switch colors, I get my brush wet, I squiggle it around in the water and I get all of the paint out of the bristles. And then I squeeze it onto I actually use a cut up t-shirt as my drying material instead of a paper towel. And it soaks up into the cotton of the rag and it leaves the brush just slightly damp. And then I can dip it into that fresh paint and I get really gloriously smooth brush strokes. This is also a great method for avoiding cross-contamination of the colors within your palette. You've probably noticed in this session that I use my palette knife to pick up bigger chunks of paint out of my palette and then I mix them on the tray. That just helps me avoid dirtying up the bristles more often, but sometimes I don't do that. I sometimes mix with the brush. So maybe try both methods and see which one works for you. So this setup means I can explore using this amazing medium in new ways, like really, really thick. And it's been such a joy to work this way. There's something really magical about mixing gouache and placing it and then blending it on the paper. I find that to be a really, really fun way of working because it kind of reminds me of acrylic or even oil, which I love. You know, is this new way of working going to be permanent for me? I can't really say, but I do feel that it is helping me to grow so much. And I've fallen even more head over heels for gouache, if that's even possible. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this subject, like how you prefer to use gouache. What tools do you use? Like, do you have any cool pieces of equipment that you want to share, or any tips and tricks you've figured out along the way? I would really love to hear that. So leave a comment below if you have something. But otherwise, I hope you guys are enjoying your summer, and you know, if you're inspired by this to go out and try to paint more thickly with gouache, let me know how it goes. Okay, I will talk to you guys soon. See you next time.